You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Since January, we've been taking a close look at the issues affecting voters ahead of the 2024 presidential election, and the reasons so many Americans across the political divide report feeling bad about the direction of the country. Many of those conversations have been about money. Who has access to it? Who's lacking? So far, it's been about the money in our checking accounts and 401ks, and how much it costs to borrow it for a car or house. But this week, we're talking about the big money, really big money, that shapes our politics and the next 4 months of the presidential race. Producer Mateo Schimpf picks it up from there.
You just heard it, but here it is again. American voters, especially in states whose economies have long relied on mining and manufacturing, are not feeling good about the direction of our country.
They feel like they don't have enough money. They can't afford anything. That's the thing people are upset about right now.
Zoe Chace is a reporter and producer for This American Life.
I feel like people have talked to me a lot about their car payments. That stress. If you can't afford a house and you can't afford a car, it's like you can't move.
Zoe spends a lot of time talking to voters, particularly Republican voters, in Michigan and Wisconsin.
People are frustrated. The thing that I hear people say all the time is we need Trump to get prices down. And I'm like, that is hard. I don't know if presidents can do that.
The former president has, of course, made all kinds of impressive promises. He was going to repeal Obamacare, bring back manufacturing jobs, build the wall and make Mexico pay for it. And he was going to get big corporate money and all of the influence and corruption and groveling that came with it out of Washington, D.C. That message resonated with a lot of people.
The voters that I was talking to in Michigan, very zealous Trump voters who were really galvanized by the feeling that the election had been stolen from them in 2020. They wanted to get the sort of big money out of their politics. They don't like the idea that money is the one making the decisions.
It's not a novel idea. And actually, it seems like a pretty good one. That is, until you try to do it yourself.
My, this is a big crowd, and I want to just say, hello, Michigan. We love Michigan.
This is sound from a campaign rally for Michigan Republicans in October 2022.
Your next Attorney General, Matt DePerno, and your next Secretary of State, Christina Caramo. Please come up. Come on up.
In 2021, Christina Caramo ran for Michigan's Secretary of State. And she lost, handily, by more than 500,000 votes. But at the time of this rally, nearly a year later, she'd yet to concede the result.
These people are waging war on our sovereignty.
Christina had Trump's backing, and a message that sounded a lot like the former president.
To allow private money in our elections. Do you know my opponent was one of the architects behind Zuckbucks, where they pumped...
There was this real experiment in Michigan where a big segment of the Republican Party elected this person to be head of their party.
That person was Christina. Despite losing the Secretary of State race by 14 percentage points, Michigan Republicans chose her to be their next party chair.
People in Michigan were so sick of this group of longtime Republican donors where they felt like they were never getting what they wanted and they weren't being listened to, that they liked this idea of running this gamble on this person who was kind of pure, just no money.
Christina was fresh, an outsider, untethered from the beck and call of the Republican establishment.
She had nothing, didn't have any donors. And that's usually part of somebody's pitch if they're going to be head of a party, is that they have connections to donors so that, they're going to be able to run campaigns. You just need money to run campaigns and to win campaigns.
For Christina's supporters, that fantasy faded pretty quickly.
A lot of people really didn't like that experience. They didn't like feeling totally strapped. They didn't like feeling like they had to all pay their own gas in order to travel the state. They couldn't afford to live like that, and they didn't like that it felt like they had no chance against the Democratic establishment in Michigan, which has a ton of money, Democrat governor, Democrat House, and Democrat Senate. So I think there's a feeling that the big money sucks if it's making all the calls, but you don't want to be out of the game. Like, you want to be on the field challenging people.
Christina's position as the leader of Michigan's Republican Party, it didn't last very long. In January 2024, less than a year after her appointment, the state Republican Party voted to remove her from the job. One of the reasons, her ousters said, a lack of financial stability in fundraising. Despite what feels like the obvious truth of Christina's story, that you can't actually win elections without playing the big money politics game, Trump's message to his supporters is that he can outmaneuver that reality.
I think Trump's brand and just way that he relates to voters and the general public, you don't think he's taking, or he doesn't appear to be someone who's taking direction from moneyed interests, even though of course he is.
Do you feel like some of those voters feel like he doesn't need the money?
Yeah, totally. That was a huge selling point at the RNC. People saying he doesn't need to be doing this. So many speakers kept saying that. He doesn't need to be doing this. He could just be with his family, enjoying his wealth. He could just be golfing on one of the golf courses that he owns, but he's doing it for you. He's not tainted by the donations because he doesn't need them. I think that makes people feel good or makes people feel safe.
Regardless of how people feel about the amount of cash in their wallets or the money flowing in and out of campaign coffers, this past month has made it clear just how much the money really does matter. After announcing her plans to run for president, Vice President Kamala Harris has raised a record-breaking amount of cash. And Donald Trump? He recently got his own massive boost from tech billionaire Elon Musk, reportedly to the tune of $180 million, although Musk has since challenged that figure.
Right now he needs money like that kind of Elon Musk money. But that doesn't mean he's going to take direction from Musk, and I don't think it feels like he's going to, even if he does.
Trump's anti-establishment, anti-censorship message has united blue-collar workers with some of the coastal elites they used to rail against. Zoe says that despite wanting to get corporate money out of politics, the Musk pledge is something Trump voters could probably get behind.
I could see people being like, okay, good, so we have money to fight with.
Still, it's hard to imagine them feeling like he actually needs it. Like so much of politics these days, sometimes the truth doesn't matter, so long as you believe. Zoe did a great story about Christina Caramo and the Michigan GOP last December. It really digs in on the existential crisis the state party was facing, and all the characters at the center of that struggle. You can find that and her latest reporting from the Republican National Convention at thisamericanlife.org.
Elon Musk may be walking back just how many millions he'd contribute to the Trump campaign, but his support for the former president seemingly hasn't wavered, and in Silicon Valley, Musk doesn't stand alone. They say millions of voters don't really start to pay attention to the presidential race until after Labor Day. If that's really true, millions of us will come back from July and August and wonder, what the hell happened? What we can call the race so far? Contentious, divisive, surprising, and expensive. Both parties are scrambling for small donors, for unrestricted money for associated groups that aren't the official campaign, and they're vying for the attention of big money donors too. California, North and South, was prized by fundraisers of both parties, and perhaps stereotypically, entertainment and tech were both thought to be places more friendly to Democrats. The truth is a little more complicated than that. Steven Levy joins us now. He's an author and editor-at-large at Wired. His weekly newsletter for Wired, called Plain Text, covers the latest news in tech and drops each Friday which means, I guess, a recent edition was on readers' devices before the big Biden bombshell dropped. Stephen, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
You've covered this world for a long time. Give us some context on how Silicon Valley has aligned itself politically for the last 25 years. Has its orientation shifted over time?
Yeah, generally, the people in tech are optimists and they consider themselves humanists. And the default has been they would lean to the Democratic side. Maybe if there's a moderate Republican candidate, he would peel off a little more of the money from some of the people running the shows. But by and large, Barack Obama that did a mind meld with Google when he was running, and later Joe Biden, and before that even Bill Clinton, who was really close with Steve Jobs, would be able to count on Silicon Valley as a big source of funds.
But one thing that's changed in the last 25 years is the kind of money we're talking about. It got huge. And I'm wondering if these men, and I'll use men because they are mostly men, changed as they got both older and richer and responsible for a bigger chunk of the economy.
Yeah, there's something that's been happening in Silicon Valley over the past, I want to say decade, where some of the people who started out, as a lot of younger people do, idealistic, made a fantastic amount of money. And some of the valuations of these companies went from billions to, in some cases, trillions. And the people funding them and sometimes leading them became multi-billionaires themselves. And they became a little different. And I think some of them felt that they were being criticized unfairly simply because they were super rich and led super rich lives. So over the past few years, there's been this tension between the rich tech bros, if you want to call them that, and the people who might be criticizing them, like the media and groups affiliated with the left. So this tension has come to a head in the Trump era as he's offered a way for them really to express themselves, let their inner spirit animals of greed come out and jump over to the other side.
I met a lot of these people when they were young, and their companies were definitely comers and fast-growing entities, but there was almost a little bit of being flattered, like almost surprised that people were seeking them out. But as they got to be bigger names themselves, did they also enter an attention must be paid phase where they thought, yeah, naturally, people want to talk to us and we've got something to say?
Yeah, I think the apotheosis of this is a recent podcast between the co-founders of Silicon Valley's arguably most influential and powerful venture capital firm, Andreessen Horowitz, and the eponymous founders, Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz, had this 90-minute chat where they explained why they were, both of them, I think, were Biden donors in the previous cycle, now going to support Donald Trump and give money to him. And they were super explicit about exactly what you're talking about. Andreessen said, it used to be you would make a lot of money and maybe you wouldn't be taxed too much, but then you'd give your money away in philanthropy and people would honor you for that and they would admire you for that. And saying, and now the people aren't doing that anymore. And his eyes were opened, he said, when Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, he's worth over $100 billion now, he and his wife Priscilla said that they were going to give eventually 99% of their money away. Zuckerberg's got this foundation that wants to get rid of all disease. And he said that people looked at that with suspicion. They said, oh, you're just doing that to cleanse your reputation for all the things that Facebook was doing. You're trying to avoid taxes. And he said, boy, that really changed me. And I think, wow, he's really saying it out loud, that the reason why you do philanthropy is because you are honored for it. And if people aren't going to respect you for it, then maybe you won't do it. Maybe it's not just to do good, but to be honored for doing good. The other thing is that Zuckerberg, even though he hasn't come out in favor of Trump, and, as far as I know, he's still the Democrat, has lately praised Donald Trump, saying what a badass he was for surviving the assassination attempt.
It has been an interesting thing to watch as people like Larry Ellison have taken on a kind of darker view of the country and the world as they've gotten both richer and, in their own view and in the view of others, more essential. A lot of money courses through their enterprises, and investors in their enterprises have made a lot of money as well. This idea that we are people who must be heard has been interesting to watch.
Right. And, one name we haven't mentioned here is Elon Musk. And so maybe he is the prime example. He spent $44 billion to acquire Twitter. And people said, why is he doing that? Wow, he's got Tesla, he's got SpaceX, he's boring tunnels. Why do that? And it looks like what he gets out of it is this voice for himself and a way to control the conversation and to make sure that his voice is the one that's being heard. He can use algorithms to ram it down our throats, everything he thinks of. And he's become a MAGA guy.
I think a lot of them wouldn't cop to being either Democrats or Republicans. Am I right about that? They would identify their political orientation.
Yeah, I want to be clear. The majority of these people, I think, were Biden supporters and are going to support Harris. But there is a substantial minority of people and ones that make themselves heard who have gone to the other side. And for the reasons that we're talking about, they want to be heard and they feel that they're being ignored. In a way, it's like a upper level version of the resentment that people maybe in the heartland might feel that they're being ignored and they're not being heard. This is like the billionaires' version of that.
Well, you mentioned the Horowitz and Andreessen showing a little leg. Let's talk about the term they coined, little tech. When they use that reference, what are they talking about and why is it important for this conversation?
Yeah, it's really interesting that both parties now seem to be aligned against what was known as big tech, companies like Google or Amazon or Meta, thinking that these companies have quasi-monopolies and might even have to be broken up. They have too much power. And Andreessen and Horowitz are speaking, as are others like J.D. Vance, on what is known as like little tech, which means startups with actually ambitions themselves to become big tech and have valuations of multiple billions of dollars, but they don't run things right now. And they say, with some reason, that these upstarts are the ones where innovation takes place. And they point to things like the breakthrough that led to all the advances in the last couple of years of artificial intelligence came from Google, but Google didn't really do much with it. It was OpenAI, a startup, which did ChatGPT and other products like it. And it took Google a while to actually exploit its own technology. So they're saying the innovation comes from these little companies, which aren't so little, but that's the ones we should support. I look at that, though, and I'm thinking, well, there's no lack of opportunity for little companies. There's a company called Y Combinator, which is an accelerator of technology companies. Young founders apply to them and they give them some funding and like $150,000 for a small chunk of the company. And then they get to begin their journeys. Well, 50,000 companies applied in the last class of Y Combinator to be in that group, right? And 500 of them get accepted. So there's no lack of desire and opportunity to be a small tech company. So I think this little tech thing where, sure, it's important. I just don't think that's an endangered species. It's the American dream.
You mentioned AI and also in the area of cryptocurrency. Is there a possible falling out of love going on with Democrats because it's anticipated, because it's assumed that they might take a harder line when it comes to regulation of these nascent and potentially blockbuster industries.
Yeah, I mean, something really interesting is happening in the crypto world and politics. The Republicans, Trump and Vance, have seen an opportunity to jump on this bandwagon, even though I would love to hear Donald Trump explain what Bitcoin is. Nonetheless, he's going to address a giant Bitcoin conference in the next week. And so they feel that there's people for whom this is a single issue voting decision, that, because they're going to go all out and end regulation of crypto, they'll get votes of a chunk of the population, and even more important, big donations from these rich people. Andreessen and Horowitz are funders of one of the biggest crypto companies, a company called Coinbase. And they were complaining that they have not been able to get a personal interview, a personal meeting with the head of the SEC, who has been tough in regulating these crypto companies and saying, wait a minute, these should be regulated like securities. They're investment tools. And they were complaining, it's our right to be able to talk to any cabinet member or head of an agency because we're who we are and they should be sitting down with us. And basically, they want the guy fired because he's not talking to them.
I'm wondering also whether a young founder, the kind of person you discussed earlier, also has to go a little bit of an evolution, maybe a change in focus after they get their startup money, after their promising idea starts to really make them some money. Does their idea about taxation change and how the tax code treats companies like theirs and profits like theirs? There's a political dimension to that as well.
Oh, that definitely. So there's a feeling among a lot of people, and more on the Democratic side, that super wealthy people should pay a higher share of taxes. Maybe someone who is a billionaire shouldn't be paying less taxes percentage-wise than the people who clean their offices. Right now, that's not the case. And, significantly, what Andreessen and Horowitz described as the final straw, the thing that just drove them into Donald Trump's arms, was a proposal in Biden's budget that people with a net worth of over $100 million should pay on some of the unrealized capital gains of the investments they make, right? So just think about that. Of the poor people who are worth only $100 million having to pay a little extra tax because of that. Andreessen even said, well, they say it's a billionaire's tax, but that's a lie. People paying who are only worth $100 million have to pay this.
Well, look, I think we should spend a little time on why that's particularly pertinent to people in this part of the economy. Unrealized gains. You have to remember that these founders start off with a certain share of the company that they're creating in stock, or if they are executives, they're often paid in stock or stock options, and they haven't sold, which means the profits aren't sitting there in their bank passbook. They haven't made the money yet. This wealth, this $100 million, let's say, is not actually dollars and cents that have been, in tax talk, realized. Are Horowitz and Andreessen, at least, legitimately scared about taxation that looks to target unrealized gains, the increase in value on stocks you haven't sold yet?
Actually, they do have a point that it's important if this happens. And by the way, this is never going to happen. That they're never going to get a wealth tax. But, in a lot of cases, there's a period of years sometimes where the company's valuation can go up considerably and you can't sell it because the company isn't liquid. But I think there's ways to write around that. Maybe you say like after a period, 10 years or something like that, a company might have to allow secondary sales so people can be liquid. So people wouldn't have to get rid of stock or be locked into stock that they can't sell and they have to pay taxes on it. So I think there's ways around that could address those concerns.
So the fact that Horowitz and Andreessen are bringing this up You say it's never going to happen. Do they want to punish Democrats for even broaching the subject?
Look, Elizabeth Warren really is their number one enemy. They cite that provision in the Biden budget, again, which I don't think is going to happen, as something that Elizabeth Warren forced Biden to take on. There's this other thing called the carried interest credit, which is a loophole that private equity people have that enables them to make their business advising investors the money they make on that, which really is from their jobs, they never have to pay taxes on. Everyone agrees that's a crazy loophole that should end.
Even Donald Trump was against it.
And even that didn't happen then. So a wealth tax is really like fantasy land. But I just think the idea of proposing it makes people like Andreessen and Horowitz insane. And that indicates how far they veered away from their relatively humble origins. Andreessen came from a not wealthy background in the Midwest. And Horowitz actually has a pretty interesting background. His father, who was a writer in academia, who was actually a flaming left liberal person, who was editor of Ramparts magazine, who then went over to the other side and became an ultra-conservative.
Recently, Donald Trump held a fundraiser in San Francisco hosted by David Sachs, who's a tech entrepreneur. Was this a surprising gathering? And do you think there are a lot more people in the room than there would have been when Trump first ran for president in 2016?
Yeah, most of the people in that room were of the tech bro variety. They've been griping about the media and saying that they're unappreciated. But, one of them, the co-host of that, was a fellow named Chamath Palihapitiya, former Facebook executive, who's now a big venture capitalist, who was a giant donor to Biden in the last cycle. And he has talked considerably about his biographical information, where he came from really a challenged background in immigration and wanted to support the little guy and people coming across the border to contribute to the economy. So it's just striking now that he's become a big Trump supporter.
Well, there are 100 days left, and it looks like there's going to be a Californian on the ticket, and a Californian with a history in law enforcement and regulation in California. Any early line on Kamala Harris and her relationship to Silicon Valley?
In the hearings I've seen her in, she has been tough on some of the big tech executives. I remember I attended one, I think Mark Zuckerberg was in the firing line, a Senate hearing, and gave him quite a grilling there. So I think, as with the Biden administration, she would be tough on big tech. She'd probably continue the tough regulation that we've seen from the FTC, antitrust actions from the DOJ. But on the other hand, I think she would also continue the Biden policy of supporting tech and things like the CHIPS Act and other kinds of investments in research.
Is it safe to assume that she knows this world a little better than most Washington politicians?
Definitely. Every politician in California deals with, and they hope benefits from the donations of tech and gets to know those CEOs pretty well.
Steven Levy is the editor-at-large at Wired magazine and author of the weekly tech newsletter Plain Text. Steven, thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
It was a pleasure, Ray. Thank you.
Before we go, we have two exciting political programs to announce. On Tuesday, July 30th, Commonwealth Club World Affairs will host a week-to-week roundtable featuring some of the Bay Area's best political minds. And on Monday, August 12th, a week before the Democratic National Convention, I'll be live in San Francisco for a special DNC preview with the Lincoln Project's Stuart Stevens. You can buy tickets at commonwealthclub.org. You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you, with special support from Mark and Maury Jane Perry, and Ann and Greg Avis. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.